Welcome back to the promo tutorial series. Today we'll cover the basics of our UI edit mode, and by the end of this video, you should have the basic understanding necessary to start designing and planning the UI for your own world. Let's begin. We'll start this tutorial with the basic template, and we'll click on our UI editor button to access our UI edit mode. And we'll do a quick overview of the different sections that we see on screen here, beginning with our preset list panel. Opening this up, we can see that we have our UI tab open. And here we have a collection of different preset assets available to you. And I'll click on each of these to kind of show you what they look like. We have a status bar, we have a chat window up there, we have an HP gauge, we have a leaderboard button, we have scale slots, a lot of different assets available here. And we can see that as we drop each of these in, scripts start to populate that are relevant to the UI presets. So you can open these up and you can explore the different assets associated with each of these presets and learn how they work, modify them to your own specific use case, things like that. We'll get rid of all of the UI for now. And moving to our UI path information, up here in the top left corner of our scene, you can see that we have the toast group currently selected. And this just shows us what our current UI pathing is. Meaning, if we change, let's say, to the pop-up group, we can see that our current UI path is the pop-up group. And as I open this up and explore all of the different assets here, under the pop-up group, we can see a pop-up back UI. And we can see that it updates our pathing. And I can go further down and it continues to update all the way down into our pop-up message. And this just kind of shows how our entities are related to each other. And I can kind of move between these and select these if I'd like. Now notice though that even though I select a different entity in a different group, for example, let's say I select this UI joystick, I currently have the UI joystick selected, but it's not rendered on screen because we have the wrong UI group. So because we have the pop-up group currently selected, we have to switch to the default group to actually see the entity that we want to edit. Moving on, we have our canvas, and this just is basically a screenshot of our world. And on top of it, we have the UI rendered for our respective group. So as I mentioned, currently we have the UI default group selected. So that is what's rendered on screen. We switch to the other groups, the UI for the other groups will be rendered. Next, we have our basic tools on the left side here. And these are just easy ways to drop different types of UI components in. So let's switch it to the toast group so we can see what's going on. We can see that I can drop in a basic image. I can drop in a button, a scroll view. We can see, text. And then finally, we have input text, where the user can input text into this box. And again, these are just quick and easy ways to just start dropping different base UI components onto our canvas here. And finally, we've been kind of talking about this entire time, but we of course have our UI groups panel. And as I mentioned, this is just to categorize the different groups of our UI. Currently, we have the toast group selected. We can switch to our pop-up group and default group, but we can rename each of these groups. None of these are locked to the group namings that have been defined here. We can modify these to be whatever group we'd like. We can say group 1, group 2, and group 3. But I mean, these aren't really descriptive and they won't really tell us exactly what is contained within these respective groups. So it's better to keep the group namings a little bit more descriptive to know how we're currently categorizing the different groups. And we can of course add and delete our own groups. So I can click on this plus button here to create a new UI group. And we can see that by default the name is UI group, but I can name this to whatever, my new group. And I can start collecting UI within this group as well. I'll delete this new group by clicking on the trash can button, confirm the deletion. And finally, within each of these groups, we'll go into the property panel. And I want to highlight this property in our UI group component called the default show. If this is enabled, all of the UI contained within this group will be disabled by default. So currently, if we select each of these groups, we can see that they are activated. But of course, with these pop-ups, we don't want this to be visible at the start of the game, even though they are currently enabled. So because this is unchecked, all of the children contained within this group will be disabled by default, and through script components, they can be enabled again. But if the default show is toggled off, then by default, all of its children will be disabled. Conversely, with something like the default group, these are all buttons and UI components that we want to be visible at the start of the world. And because of that, we have checked our default show on, and all of the UI will be enabled by default at the start of this world. Now, before we move any further, we first need to be familiar with some basic concepts pertaining to UI coordinates. So let's begin our discussion by first talking about the differences between world space coordinates and screen space coordinates. So on screen, we have a fountain angel entity, and this entity is named MapObject13, and it has a transform component and a SpriteRenderer component. And within the transform component, we have a property known as world position that gives it a world position. It has X, Y, and Z coordinates, and it defines its coordinate within the world. However, this coordinate position defines its position within world space. When it comes to UI, we work on a different coordinate system. In UI, we have what's known as screen space, and this is based on pixel resolution and screen resolution. So let's say, for example, we have an 800 by 600 resolution screen, and we have this button positioned at exactly 700 in the positive direction of the X, and 200 in the positive direction of the Y. And notice that these coordinates are based on the center of the screen. Now, let's say, for example, we increase this resolution to something a lot bigger. Our canvas is now 1600 by 1200, but our coordinate position hasn't changed. It's still 700 in the X and 250 in the Y. But our relative position of our button, relative to the screen size, is now no longer at the same position. So how do we resolve this? Well, for example, if we wanted our button to always be at the top right-hand corner of our screen, instead of picking a point relative to the center to start our offsets, we can instead pick a point in the top right-hand corner. So now we can set what's known as an anchor point up to the top right-hand corner of our screen. So now our positions are relative to that corner in the -300 in the Y and -450 in the X. And this gives us the exact same position of our button now. However, as our screen shrinks and increases, the button's relative position to the corner will stay exactly the same. So if this button, let's say, was a pause button that we wanted to be always stuck to the corner of our screen, no matter what our resolution is, it will always be in a similar position. If we wanted to change that anchor point, let's say to the middle, then we can, of course, move our anchor point to the top middle of our screen, and we can set different coordinate offsets such that our button will always stay anchored to the top of our screen. So if our Y resolution increased or decreased, it will still be in a similar position relative to the top of our screen. Let's head back to the editor to go into a more visual example. So we're back in our maker, and we'll make sure to have our UI edit node toggled on. And down in our UI groups, let's click on the plus button to create a new group, and we'll name this group, let's say, UI examples. And we'll utilize this group as a playground of sorts to test around and see how our different UI components work. So among our UI tools, let's select the image tool and place an image onto our canvas here. And with this UI entity, we have a UI transform component and we have a SpriteGUIRenderer component. Now, as we discussed earlier, our UI is based off of pixel offsets. So currently we have a strange number here. This is basically 0. So we'll just kind of make that a little bit easier to read. But we have an X pixel offset of 0 and a Y pixel offset of 0. And we have a pixel width and a pixel height as well. So we can increase the width to something like 200 and make the height something like 300, and we can see that it affects the size of our image. We'll reset these values back. If I increase my X offset to say something like 50, we can see that it moves to the right. Giving it a negative value moves it to the left. Giving it a Y offset of 50 moves it up, and the negative brings it down. We'll reset this back to 0. Now, let's say that we want this image to be always in the top left-hand corner of our screen. So if you just kind of drag this image up to the top left-hand corner, we can see that we have an X offset of something around -880 and the Y offset of around 460. because these are fixed pixel offsets, as soon as our resolution changes, because our anchor point is in the center, these pixel offset coordinates will no longer work for different resolutions. So a great way to test this is in the top left-hand corner of our scene view, we have where it says PC, we can switch to utilizing our mobile simulator. Now, this will simulate different devices, and if we click on this drop-down list, we can see that we have a large list of different devices to choose from. Currently, we're selected on the iPad 5th gen. We can change to something like the Galaxy Note 10, which has a much larger screen resolution. Now, notice that we have a little gap here, and this is due to the notches that a lot of recent phones have. If we click on our Safe Area button here, a little border in yellow appears, defining where it's safe to place our UI. And any anchor points will be relative to the center of this safe area. Anything beyond that is at risk of being covered by, phone-specific notches and things like that. So that's why we have this little gap here. Let's switch back to the Apple iPad for just a moment. And we'll notice that our image is no longer in the top left-hand corner where we wanted it to be. And our Y pixel offset is now not enough. Now, if we bumped it up, now going back to our PC, it's way too much now. So for different resolutions, this is going to be a problem having this kind of fixed pixel offset relative to the center. A way to fix this is just to simply change the anchor point. So in our UI transferring component, we have a little grid with a dot in the center of it. If we click on this, we can see various different anchor presets available to us. We have some anchor presets that will allow us to stretch the image across the width or height of the screen, or even stretch the entire width of the entire screen. But we'll go into these in just a little bit, and we'll focus our attention in these grids in the center here. And we want to select the one that has the dot in the top left-hand corner of our screen, and we'll select that. And now our X and Y pixel offsets are a lot different. Before, when we had it in the center, we have a negative offset of negative 877 in the X, and a positive Y offset of something in the 600s. But in the corner, now our offset is positive 82 in the X, and negative 86 in the Y. Just to make it a little bit more easier, we'll make these more uniform values. Let's say 80 from the left and negative 80 from the top. And with that, our sprite image is now anchored to the top left-hand corner of our screen. So if we switch to a different resolution, let's say the Galaxy Note 10 again, now our image is anchored to exactly where we wanted it to be, and it's always going to be stuck to the corner. Notice though that our anchor is relative to the safe area. So if we click toggle this on once more, our anchor is anchored to the top left-hand corner of the safe area, not to the width of the entire screen. We'll swap our environment back to the PC. Now say that we want to know exactly what the distance between the left side and the top side is. Currently, we have it as 80 in the X and negative 80 in the Y. But that doesn't mean that this offset between the left side wall and the left side wall of our image is 80 pixels. The offset is actually relative to the center of our image, and this is defined by our pivot property. If we zero out our X and Y positions, our image is not snapped to the top corner of our screen because the pivot point of our image is in the center. If we change this pivot point to 0 and 0, now our pivot point is in the bottom left-hand corner of our sprite image, and our X and Y pixel offsets are a little bit different now. So if we zero these again, our pivot point and our anchor point snaps together to be in the same position. If I wanted my pivot point to be in the top left-hand corner of my image, I could simply just leave the X pivot to be 0, and I can change my Y pivot to be 1. I can zero out my Y again, and now it's snapping to the top left-hand corner of my screen. Keep in mind that the pivot property is based on percentage value between 0 and 1, with 0, 0 being the bottom left-hand corner of my image. This time, if I want to give my image exact pixel offsets of maybe exactly 30 pixels from the left-hand side and negative 30 pixels from the top, now this distance between the left side wall and top wall is both exactly 30 pixels. So messing around with the anchor points and the pivot positions will allow us to have a little bit more granular control over our images. Now finally, we'll go over the different anchor positions with a stretch value. Now we have these stretch anchors highlighted in blue, and this will allow us to stretch our image to the entire width and also anchor them to relative positions on our screen. So this first one, with the little blue highlight in the top, will allow us to stretch our image across the entire top of our screen. Clicking this, we can see that it's no longer an X and Y offset. It is now an offset from the left side and an offset from the right side. If we zero out these values, we can tell our anchor that we want 0 offset from our left side and 0 offset from our right side. And now our image stretches to the entire width of our screen. If you switch to our mobile view, no matter what our resolution is, it will always stretch to the entire width of our screen. Now, because we have a Y pixel offset, it does not snap exactly to the top. But if we said this was 0, it snaps exactly to the top of our screen with a 0 pixel offset. Same thing with our pivots. If we had a pivot of 0.5, so it's in the center, and then we zero this out, now the top of our screen is aligned with the center of our image. We don't want that. Let's set this back to 1 and zero out the Y. These other ones will change our Y anchor points to either be in the top, middle, or bottom. So if we select the one in the middle, we can zero it out. And we can see that our image stretches and anchors to the middle. And finally, the one in the bottom stretches and anchors to the bottom. As you might guess, these are vertical stretches. So if we select this one on the left, so let's zero out the top and we'll zero out the bottom. Let's give this a specific width of around 100. And as we saw with our horizontal stretch, it's now stretching vertically to our screen. And these other ones, as you might guess, anchors to the center or anchors to the right. Finally, we have one that stretches to the entire width of our screen. And if we give it a 0 pixel offset on the left, a 0 pixel offset on the right, and 0 in the top and 0 in the bottom. All of these are offsets from the walls of our screen. And if we give it zeros on all 4 sides, it will stretch the entire width of our screen. So let's try building out a more practical example and say this image was a background to an inventory UI. So currently, we have our image to be stretched to the entire screen, and we have 0 offsets all around. Let's give it maybe a 200 pixel offset from the left, 200 from the right, and around 150 from the top, and 150 from the bottom. Now, this mostly looks like a square on screen right now, but if we switch to a different resolution, say the Note 10, it looks a little bit different and it looks a little strange because it's stretching and keeping the same pixel offsets from the left, top, and bottom, but our screen width is a lot larger than the iPad. If we wanted to have a very fixed window size, we can switch back to our center anchor. Notice what happens if I try to zero out the X and Y positions. Our pivot point is still in the top left-hand corner of our screen, and that's why the center pivot is aligning with the top left-hand corner pivot that we have for our image. We want our pivot to be in the center now, so we'll give it a 0.5 and a 0.5. And now if we zero this out, it is in the center. So be very careful with your pivot points and your anchors and understand the relationship between the two as you start building out and designing a UI. Now, I want an exact square. I'll give it a uniform value of 800 pixels in the width and its height. And now, no matter what resolution I go to, it is always going to be an exact square, albeit not covering the same percentage of the screen. So now white is a little boring, so we want to change this out to a different image. If you look into our SpriteGUIRenderer component, as we saw in an earlier episode with our SpriteRenderer component, we have an image RUID value. So we can change this out to any RUID that we'd like, and we'll go into our resource storage. And among the resources that I've uploaded, I want to select one of my frames. So I have a collection of frames here. I kind of like this orange one as the background. So we'll copy this RUID and we'll try pasting it in. Now, see what happens as I paste in this RUID. Now I want my borders to be a little smaller and maybe the center to be stretched out a little more. So to do that, we have what's called a slice type. So within our types, we have different types available, and our slice type will allow us to define certain points and regions of our image to stretch out and what regions to keep the same resolution. So if we go into our resource stores once more and we go into the details panel, we have a sprite slice button. If we click edit on this, we can see different offsets to place our border points. We know that this pixel has a width and height of 177 by 188. I want to give this, say, an offset of 80 all around. And the region that gets created in the center by all of these overlapping borders here is the region that gets expanded and contracted as our sprite gets scaled up and down. And the region outside of this center will be kept the exact same resolution. So if we click apply, and we copy the RUID. Now at the time of this recording, we have to delete and repaste this image in. But notice what happens. Our center has now expanded, but the edges of our image has kept its same resolution. So the frame edges now look a lot smaller and is at the resolution that I'd like it to be. If we uncheck the center, we can see the region that has been expanded. Everything outside of the expanded region is the same resolution of our source image. We have different types, of course. We have the simple type, which keeps the same resolution and doesn't utilize the sprite slicing. And I encourage you to explore some of these other ones as well. But I just wanted to go over the sliced because that's a very unique concept that we do have to define slicing regions for our images for it to work properly. So now that we have a background for our inventory UI, we need a way to close our inventory. So we'll click the button from our UI tools, and we'll set the width to something like 75 and the height of 75. And watch what happens when I try to snap my anchor to the top right-hand corner of this window here. So I wanted to snap to the corner of this window, but as we know, currently it snaps to the corner of this screen. So if I zero out my X and Y offsets, we can see that it does indeed snap to the corner of my screen. Then how do I get this image to snap to the corner of my window here? We actually just have to parent this UI button into our frame. So we'll drag this up into our inventory frame. And if we zero out our offsets now, it does snap to the corner of my frames. So my anchor will always be relative to my direct parent. Because my button was previously childed to my UI examples, which is the entire group, that's why it snapped to the top right hand corner. But because its direct parent is now the inventory frame, its anchor is now relative to the frame. So I want it to snap to the top right hand pivot. So we'll select our UI button again and make my pivot 1 and 1 and zero out the offsets again. And we can see that it snaps exactly to the corner. We'll give it a negative offset of say 25 and negative 25. And now that looks more like a close button. As a last step, let's change out our image. So we can select from a couple different presets. And we have a couple quick ones here. So we can select this X. And now it looks a little bit more like a close button. And within our button component, we have a transition value. So if you press play right now, clicking on our button will simply kind of darken it. And if we change our press color to something completely different, like a red, when we press it, it changes to red. We can also play around with the different highlighted colors, its normal color. This is just its idle normal color. And the highlighted color is when you kind of select over it. Selected color is when you pressed it, and it will stay that color until you select off of it onto a different UI. We can change our transition to something different. So if we want a sprite swap instead, now instead of having color tints based on our different interactions, we can change it to be specific sprite. So when I press the sprite, I want to change to a different sprite. So if I select this one, and now if I press play, pressing my button will actually change out my sprite. Now because this is an inventory UI, we need a list of items, so that's where our scroll view tool comes in. And we'll select this tool to bring in our scroll layout entity. And we can see that it has a single image entity contained within it. And we want the scroll layout's positioning and anchor points to be relative to the frame. So we'll again child this underneath the inventory frame. And if we duplicate this image a bunch of times, we can see that it automatically gets organized into a grid layout. And as our list starts to grow bigger than the size of its container, a scroll bar appears so that we can drag and scroll through our inventory. If I press play, we can see I can scroll up and down to navigate throughout my inventory items. Let's delete my images, and we'll replace the image with something that looks a little bit more like it would be in my backpack. So let's say I want this food item to be in my backpack, and I'll paste the RUID in. And now I can have a bunch of food in my backpack. Now I want my scroll layout to stretch and contract with the size of my screen. So if later on I decided this frame is too small and I change this to something a lot bigger, like 1000. Now my inventory does not scale and stretch with it. So we will change my anchors to cover the entire width of my inventory frame. And we'll set the left offset to say 25, the right offset to 25, and we'll give it a top offset of say 100. Maybe that's a little too small, we'll give it 200. And from the bottom, let's give it maybe 50 pixels. So now we have a nice grid of our inventory items. And my inventory items I think is a little too small. So in my scroll layout entity, I have a scroll layout group component. In here, we have the type of layout that we'd like. So currently we have a grid layout, but we have different layouts available to us. We'll go into these in just a moment. But with this grid layout, I can control the size of my children. So I want to be big chunks of meat. So let's change this to be 200. And now they're a lot larger and a lot more visible. So now notice that we have a little bit of space on the right side here, and this is because our child alignment is not in the middle. So we have a grid child alignment property here. And if we change this, currently it's kind of stuck to the upper left side, but we want it to be upper center so that it's kind of centered within our frame. And we can also change the grid spacing, which is the space in between our different elements. And we'll give it maybe a little bit more, 15 pixels, and the X, I think maybe 20, seems decent. And now it looks a little better and spaced nicely in my UI. So we'll press play just to test to make sure that this all works. And we can scroll through our meat in our inventory. If I wanted to change this to a different layout, I can select my scroll layout entity, and I can change the type to be, let's say, horizontal. Now, this makes all of my inventory items to be laid out horizontally, and we can see that our scroll bar is in a horizontal direction now. If I change my child alignment to be the left middle, it kind of centers to the middle of my screen. And if I press play, I can scroll through a horizontal list of my inventory items. The vertical layout, as you can imagine, works in a very similar way. I'll change my child alignment to be the upper center. And if I press play again, now we can scroll vertically through my list of items. We'll change this back to my grid layout. Now our scroll bar looks a little bit boring at the moment. So we can change our scroll bar handle color to, let's say, a different color, like a white color. And it looks a little better, but we can actually go a step further and we can change our scroll bar handle image RUID. So we can select the presets, and let's say this orange one. And if we close our window out, we can see that we have a nicer looking scroll bar to replace our boring old one. Moving on, I want to have a title so that players that open this window know exactly what it is. So let's click on the text tool to bring a text in. And again, we want this to always be centered in the top of our screen. So let's child this under our inventory frame, and we'll anchor this to be the top center. And we will zero out the Y position and the X position. Make sure that our pivot is 1 in the Y, and we'll zero out the Y again. And we'll give this a negative 25 pixel offset from the top. And let's make the width a little bigger. So let's make this maybe 200. Actually, we can just change it to scale to the entire width. So we will select the top stretching anchor, and we'll give it maybe a 20 pixel offset from the left side and a 20 pixel offset from the right side. And let's increase our font size to something a lot bigger, and we can change our font type to be Maple. And for the text, we'll change it to inventory. And we'll change our font color to maybe white. And we will also give it an outline. We'll change the outline color to be black. And we'll give the inventory outline width a little bit less of a outline width. Let's bump the font size up just a little bit more. And now we have our title for our inventory. Now we have one more tool to go over, and that is the input text tool. And for the sake of this tutorial, let's say, for example, this was a shop inventory and not just a regular player inventory. So let's rename this to be shop inventory. So we'll add the text shop in front of that. Let's select our scroll layout group, and let's make some space for our new UI elements by bumping up the bottom offset to say something like 200. And then finally, we'll click our input text, make sure that it's a child of our inventory frame, so our positioning and anchors are relative to our inventory window. And we want our input text to be kind of more in the bottom right-hand corner. So let's select our anchor point to be at the bottom right-hand corner. We'll zero out our positioning. And we want our pivot point to be on the bottom right-hand corner of our text. So let's set our X pivot to 1, our Y pivot to 0, which should give it the pivot point to the bottom right. Let's confirm this by zeroing out our positions. And it does indeed anchor properly. Then we'll give it a X coordinate of, let's say, negative 150 for now. And a positive Y of, let's say, 50. Because we want another button on the right side here, maybe like a purchase button. And let's scale the width down a little bit to be maybe 75. Because all we need is just a number here. Let's bump it to 100, it's a little bit small. And then in our text input component, we have a couple different values and properties here. And we have the content type, and this will tell our text input component what type of input that we are expecting. Is it an integer number? Is it a decimal number? Is it alphanumeric? Is it a name, an email address? And it'll verify the content that's within our text and prevent any other characters from being inputted, so that maybe when you're reading this through text, through your script, you know exactly what kind of input you should be expecting. We know that this should always be an integer number, and we can place a text placeholder. So currently our text component has some values here. We'll delete that. And instead, we'll place a value in our placeholder. We'll say 0. And now we have a placeholder value. Let's increase the font size so that it's a little bigger and more readable. And then we can set a character limit so that it doesn't go off screen. So let's say that we want maybe at max triple digits. So we'll double check to make sure it all fits. 0, 0, 0. And it does look nice, so we'll bring this back to 0. And finally, let's place another button. So really quick, we'll anchor this to the bottom. We'll give it an X of 1 and a Y of 0. we'll zero out our positioning. We want it to be at the same height of our input, so we'll give it a y offset of 50. We'll give it a width of maybe 100. An x offset of negative maybe 50. And let's change the image out to be from one of our preset buttons. Let's give it maybe this green button. And that looks a little bit like a purchase button. We'll also add the text component on top of this button. So we'll make sure that this button is selected, and we will add the text component. And we will change this text to say buy. Let's increase the font size a little bit. And we'll change the font to Maple. Let's change our font color to be white. Let's give it a bold, and we'll give it an outline of black so it's a little bit more visible. And let's also give it a drop shadow. We'll give the distance, bring the distance down a little bit. And I think that looks nice. So if we press play now, we can change our input value. Let's say I wanted to buy 12 of one of my little meat items here. Pressing the buy button would theoretically purchase the item. And with that, we have a completed shop inventory panel. Now mind you, none of the elements within our shop inventory are actually functional. I can't actually select any of these items and click on the purchase button or close out this window at the moment, and that will require some scripting functionality. But for now, we've just mocked up our inventory UI so that in the future, we might actually go in and start scripting. Before we close out this video, I want to go over some UI best practices. When it comes to designing a UI, it's very easy to make mistakes because you're not accounting for all the different types of players of your world. I've prepared some suggestions and guidelines for you to follow to help mitigate some of those issues. Beginning with our first step, to make sure that you're accounting for all the different platforms of your world. If you only develop, let's say, for the PC, and all of your inputs and your UI are designed for the PC players, and you're not accounting for your mobile players will have a negative experience. So here, we have different UI layouts, and we've kept the positioning of our UI very strategic so that it's easy to reach some of those skill buttons and some of those inventory buttons. And on the left side, we have our mobile touch controls. So we've laid out all of our UI such that it's easy for our mobile players to access some of the inputs for our world. In our PC counterpart, we have a very different layout. So depending on what the platform is, we have different layouts and various strategies for the PC and for the mobile. We can see for the PC inputs, we have several hotkeys associated with our inventory items. And for our skill items, we have hotkeys associated as well. So if we press our shift button, we can activate our dash, and we also have our various inputs. And we also have various inventory items that are linked to our number buttons, because we know that most of our PC players or our Mac players will be utilizing their keyboard for most of their character controls. And it's actually inconvenient to have to go in and press every single button. So in this way, make sure that you account and are thinking about both experiences for both mobile and for your PC players. Next, we always have a default overlay. And these are controls for your players no matter what world they are in, for things like their social buttons, your world settings, a button to leave your world, things like that. And they will always be in the same position on the top right-hand corner of your screen and covering all of the UI. So make sure that none of your UI is covered by these overlay buttons, and keep this in mind as you develop and design your UI. We have an example range here for our UI, and this does not cover the top right-hand corner of our screen, so this is safe to do. Same thing with this layout, we have a little bit of a wider frame, but it does not cover the top right-hand buttons. If you were to cover some of these buttons, they will always take priority over the other elements in your world. So some buttons and some UI elements that you position in this area may not be accessible because they're covered by the overlay button. So make sure you keep this in mind and design your UI by avoiding those buttons in the top right. Next, make sure that your buttons are large enough so that your mobile players will actually be able to press those buttons. If your buttons are so small that a single thumb will cover multiple buttons at once, it'll be very difficult for players to interact with your world. So keep sizing in mind and constantly test in a mobile environment to make sure that all of your buttons and interactions are easy to use. When it comes to text, if you've been developing on the PC environment and everything looks completely legible, but then as soon as you try playing on mobile, what may have looked fine on desktop may look very, very small on mobile. So make sure you're considering that as well, that all of your text are completely legible for both PC and for mobile as well. In this example, we have some text on screen, and it has a very contrasting white background so that it's not difficult to read Hello MapleStory Worlds at all. But in this next example, it's so easy to miss this text because it kind of fades into the background. It has a semi-transparency, and the coloring of the text versus the background, it's very easy to miss. So certain messages that you intended to convey to your players may be easily missed because of the various coloring and contrast of the different UI elements in your world. And finally, we briefly touched on the notch that comes with several of the mobile devices, and we talked about the safe area. However, if we zero out and stretch an image to the screen, if we have 0 in the left, right, top, and bottom offsets, because it's stretching to our safe area, if we intended our image to cover the entire screen, it won't actually cover the full screen, it'll only cover that safe area. So if we actually wanted it to go beyond that safe area and cover the whole screen, we can instead give it some negative values. So we can give it a negative value in the left, right, top, and bottom so that it stretches beyond our safe area, and we can ensure that our UI covers the whole screen. And test these negative offsets so that they're in a good range for all of the different mobile simulations. So make sure you're constantly testing with the different resolutions as you play around with these settings. That's everything that we have for today. Today we've developed a basic understanding of UI. Next time, we'll be finally getting into an introduction to scripting with a MapleStory Worlds Lua language.